It's been a decade since that fateful camping trip in the Appalachian wilderness, but the memories still haunt me, as vivid and terrifying as the day they were made. I was 16 at the time, full of teenage bravado and a thirst for adventure. My cousins, Bill and Ramon, were 13 and 10 respectively, and we were all excited about spending more than a week in the great outdoors with their father, Roger. The Appalachian wilderness is a place of breathtaking beauty, with its rolling mountains, dense forests, and crystal-clear streams. As we set out on our journey, the world seemed full of possibility. The weather was perfect: warm, sunny days gave way to breezy, starlit summer nights. We engaged in all the classic camping activities, fishing in the pristine lakes, hiking through the lush forests, and gathering around the campfire each night to tell ghost stories before turning in. For the first few days, everything was idyllic. We'd wake up with the sun, cook breakfast over the campfire, and then set out to explore the wilderness around us. Roger, an experienced outdoorsman, taught us how to identify animal tracks, which plants were safe to eat, and how to navigate using just the sun and stars. In the evenings, we returned to camp, tired but happy, to feast on our day's catch and swap stories about our adventures. But on the fourth day, things began to change. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment when our carefree vacation took a turn for the strange and terrifying. It was evening, and we were all gathered around the campfire. The air was filled with the smell of roasting marshmallows and the sound of our laughter. Roger was busy preparing dinner, while we kids were being our usual boisterous selves. I had caught a particularly large brook trout earlier that day, and in a moment of vanity, I decided I wanted a picture to commemorate my achievement. "Hey, Bill," I called out, grabbing my digital camera from my backpack. "Take a picture of me with my fish, will you?" Bill rolled his eyes, but took the camera. I posed at the edge of our campsite, holding up my prize catch, with the dark woods as my backdrop. The flash went off, momentarily illuminating the forest behind me. At the time, I thought nothing of it, but that photo would later reveal something that still sends chills down my spine. As the night wore on, our revelry continued. The radio was playing some classic rock, adding to the festive atmosphere. But around 11 p.m., something strange happened. The music suddenly faltered, dissolving into static. Bill, ever the problem solver, started smacking the radio, trying to get it to work again. But his efforts were in vain. An eerie silence fell over the campsite. It wasn't just the radio; the usual nighttime chorus of frogs and crickets had also gone quiet. The only sound was the occasional crackle of the campfire. The sudden absence of noise was unsettling, to say the least. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was as if someone or something was watching us from the darkness beyond our circle of firelight. I glanced at the others, and from their tense postures and darting eyes, I could tell they felt it too. Ramon, being the youngest, was the first to show his fear openly. He scooted closer to Roger, clutching at his father's arm. Roger, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, forced a cheerful tone as he announced, "Let's eat." We ate in uncomfortable silence, each of us casting nervous glances into the surrounding darkness. As soon as we finished, we retreated to our tents, but sleep was elusive. I lay awake for hours, straining my ears for any sound in the oppressive silence, unable to shake the feeling of being observed. The next morning dawned bright and clear, as if to mock our fears from the night before. Birds were chirping, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and it was easy to dismiss the previous night's unease as overactive imaginations fueled by too many ghost stories. After breakfast, we set out on our planned hike. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, sunlight filtering through the canopy to create dappled patterns on the forest floor. We saw deer grazing in clearings and even spotted a black bear in the distance, though it paid us no mind. By late afternoon, we stopped in a clearing to eat lunch. The day had been going so well that I had almost forgotten about the strange events of the night before. Almost. As we sat there, munching on our sandwiches, I felt it again, that creeping sensation of being watched. Goosebumps raised on my arms and the back of my neck, and I noticed the others shifting uncomfortably. Even Roger, usually so unflappable, looked uneasy. Then, as if on cue, the forest fell silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, nothing. The silence was as sudden and complete as it had been the night before. Roger stood up, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest. "I think we should head back," he said, his voice tense. We packed up quickly and started back down the trail towards the lake. With each step, the feeling of being observed grew stronger. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something. But there was never anything there, just trees and shadows. As we neared the lake, we heard a rustle in the distance. Roger held up his hand, signaling us to stop and be quiet. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. Another rustle, closer this time, coming from the tall grass near the lake shore. Roger unslung his rifle, holding it at the ready. I could see the tension in his posture, his eyes darting back and forth. He was expecting a black bear, I realized, but something told me this was no bear. We stood there, huddled together, for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, Roger lowered his gun slightly. "I think it's gone," he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Let's get back to camp." That night was another sleepless one for me. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of wind sounded like footsteps approaching our tent. I kept expecting to see a shadowy figure silhouetted against the tent wall, but nothing ever appeared. The next day was surprisingly normal. We went fishing in the morning, and I caught another large trout. In the afternoon, we went swimming in the lake. The water was cool and refreshing, and for a while, I was able to forget about the strange occurrences of the past couple of days. It wasn't until we were heading back to camp that evening that things took a turn for the truly terrifying. The sky was a beautiful canvas of oranges and yellows as we made our way back to the campsite, laughing and joking, our arms laden with fishing gear. Roger was in the lead, with us kids following behind. Suddenly, Roger stopped dead in his tracks. We crashed into him, but he didn't even seem to notice. I peered around him, curious about what had caused him to stop so abruptly. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the center of our campsite, was, well, I'm not even sure how to describe it. It was like something out of a nightmare. An effigy, I suppose you'd call it, made of thousands of small twigs and branches woven together to form a crude humanoid shape. It had a torso and 4 limbs, with twisted branches forming what looked like hands at the end of its arms. But the worst part was the head. Perched atop the twig body was a large deer skull, its empty eye sockets seeming to stare right at us. The bone was covered in strange symbols painted in what looked horribly like blood. From its antlers hung small wooden trinkets, carved with the same symbols that adorned the skull. For a moment, we all just stood there, frozen in shock and fear. Then Roger snapped into action. He gripped his rifle tightly and started barking orders like a drill sergeant. "Bill, you and the others pack up as much as you can, as fast as you can," he commanded. "Leave the tents and anything else heavy. I'm going to start the truck." I've never moved so fast in my life. We threw our belongings haphazardly into bags, leaving behind anything that wasn't absolutely essential. All the while, Roger stood guard, his rifle at the ready, as Ramon sobbed quietly in the truck. As soon as we had grabbed what we could, we piled into the vehicle. Roger gunned the engine, and we sped away down the dirt road, the silent, watching woods all around us. It wasn't until a few days after we got home that I remembered the photo I had taken by the campfire. Curious, and still trying to make sense of what had happened, I downloaded the pictures from my camera to my computer. There I was, smiling proudly and holding up my fish, the warm glow of the campfire illuminating me from the front. But something in the background caught my eye, something I hadn't noticed when the picture was taken. With shaking hands, I increased the brightness of the image. What I saw nearly made me fall out of my chair. There, partially hidden in the gloom of the forest behind me, was a face. But not a human face, at least, not entirely. It had ghostly white skin stretched tight over sharp, angular features. Its eyes were dark, sunken pits that seemed to stare right through the camera and into my soul. Its nose was flared, almost animal-like, and protruding from its bald head were what looked like antlers. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding. That face, that thing, had been there, watching us, from the very beginning. I don't know what it was that stalked us in those Appalachian woods. I don't know why it left that horrifying effigy in our camp. But I do know one thing for certain: I will never go camping in the wilderness again. Some things are better left undisturbed, and some watchers are better left unwatched. My childhood was spent amidst the wet, green embrace of a small Midwestern town where rain was as regular as church bells on Sundays. Summers were a peculiar blend of heat and dampness, and it was in this clammy weather that my fascination with mushrooms took root. I became a self-proclaimed mycologist, devoting weekends to the endless hunt for fungi. The discovery of a new species, rare, exotic, or just plain odd, was a thrill that no video game or classroom could replicate for me. It all began one ordinary morning as I raced to catch the school bus. Glancing down, I spotted a puffball poking out between the blades of grass in my front yard. That simple discovery ignited a passion within me that would shape my childhood and lead me to the most terrifying experience of my young life. From that day forward, I became obsessed with mushrooms. I started poking around in the little pockets of forest around my town, each one a treasure trove of fungal wonders waiting to be discovered. Within a year, I could identify most of the local species, their Latin names rolling off my tongue with the ease of a seasoned botanist. The cemetery in our town, though an unusual choice, became one of my favorite hunting grounds. It was a small plot, perhaps a few acres, nestled within a larger patch of forest. The cemetery itself was meticulously kept, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed woods that surrounded it. This juxtaposition created the perfect environment for mushrooms to thrive, and I found a strange solace in my ventures among the tombstones. The groundskeepers, initially wary of my presence, soon grew accustomed to the sight of me wandering between the graves, eyes fixed on the ground. They knew I was harmless, just a kid with an unusual hobby, and so I was given free rein to explore to my heart's content. One summer morning, right after a tremendous rainstorm, I set out with a big bag slung over my shoulder and a deep sense of anticipation. The storm had transformed the world into a sodden wonderland, and I knew it would yield a bounty of mushrooms. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, a fragrance that was just as intoxicating to me as any perfume. As I entered the cemetery, I did my usual scan of the area but didn't see anything right away. Deciding to skip the graveyard proper and hit it on my return trip, I made my way towards the back fence. However, as I approached, I noticed something was amiss. The usually pristine grounds were littered with trash, beer cans, scraps of paper, and other debris scattered about. I was baffled. The cemetery was sacred ground, meticulously maintained. Even the occasional drinker who found their way here would have been swiftly shooed away. I tried to rationalize it, thinking perhaps the storm had washed the trash from somewhere else, but the explanation felt hollow. Half of the trash was inside the cemetery, the other half just beyond the fence. It was clear that someone had thrown a party on one side or the other and left the mess for others to clean up. Despite the unsettling sight, my eagerness to hunt mushrooms overpowered my unease. I hopped the fence as usual, the metal cold against my palms. The forest had a peculiar silence about it this morning, broken only by the occasional squelch of my boots in the muddy grass. I zigzagged through the trees, eyes scanning for the familiar caps and stems of my targets. The mushrooms were indeed bountiful that morning, each cluster seeming to beckon me deeper and deeper into the woods. Soon, I reached the far edge of the hill, where I usually descended into the meadow. But today, I stopped to examine an unusual pile of objects. Discarded clothes, a scattering of beer cans, and something that looked like a bundle of plastic baggies. It was the kind of litter that felt foreign in a place like this, ominous even. I glanced around nervously, but driven by my compulsion to hunt, I pushed the strange sight from my mind and moved on. In hindsight, this was a very dumb thing to do. This little woodland outside the cemetery led to a creek that ran out of town. There were no trails, no dog-walking paths. I had literally never seen anybody else out here. Ever. Sudden evidence of somebody drinking beer should have been a massive red flag, but I continued on, blinded by my passion for fungi. The meadows stretched before me, the grass lush and wild. My eyes soon focused on a cluster of big, brown boletes, treasures that I quickly and eagerly began to collect. Time slipped away as I followed the mushrooms deeper and deeper into the meadow, their presence almost hypnotic. My usual sense of direction and caution waned as I became completely immersed in the hunt. I was caked in dirt and mud up to my elbows as I scurried around the grassland. It wasn't until I finally looked up that I realized how far I had actually wandered. The once familiar terrain had become alien to me. I found myself standing before a charred fire pit, its stones blackened and smeared with remnants of past flames. Scattered around the pit were various items, an empty bag, more beer bottles, and small wooden figurines arranged in an odd pattern. The most unsettling part of it all was the partially burned Ouija board that lay in the center. The outer edges were scorched and curling, but the center, the heart of the board, remained intact. It stared up at me, the planchette resting in its center like a grim invitation. A chill traced up my spine. The mushrooms, though still plentiful, no longer seemed enticing. I recognized at this point that something was seriously off. The remains of that fire pit and the Ouija board felt wrong, like evidence of some kind of crime that I had stumbled upon. My instincts whispered for me to turn back, but the lure of the mushrooms was far too strong. I continued up towards the creek, my eyes darting around nervously. Up ahead, I could see a huge porcini. I wanted to nab it before I turned back for home. When I reached the last slope before the creek, the sight that met me was both horrifying and surreal. A man was standing in the shallow water, washing his face. His clothes were torn and caked in what looked like dry blood. The creek was murky, but the crimson stains were unmistakable. His body was thin and sinewy, covered in prison tattoos that snaked around his limbs like dark veins. He continued to wash himself in the creek, his back to me. He reminded me of the dingy homeless guy from the old Dennis the Menace movie, long stringy hair, grimy, just out of place and strange. I watched him for longer than I should have, caught up in the shock of the moment. I also understood this wasn't the movies. I was a kid, and he was a man. If he decided to hurt me, it would probably happen. Fear coursed through me, my heart pounding in my ears. I froze, unsure whether to call out or just retreat. Before I could react, though, the man turned his head, his eyes catching the glint of the morning sun. Our gazes locked. I saw a spark of wild, frantic rage in his eyes. He almost looked just as surprised to see me as I was to him. It almost made me laugh in the moment, and for one split second, I thought maybe this guy could be normal. This whole exchange could be normal, and perhaps I was off the hook. But that fleeting hope was shattered in an instant. Without a word, he bolted from the water and began to chase me uphill. Panic surged through me as I realized how wrong I was. I dropped my sack of mushrooms, the weight of them no longer registering. I sprinted back uphill toward the cemetery fence, the only sanctuary I could think of. The distance seemed insurmountable. Every breath felt like fire in my lungs. I glanced back, seeing the man's gaunt figure slowly gaining on me. His eyes were wide with fury, his screams raw and primal, echoing through the trees. Why the hell was he screaming? It scared the shit out of me. I actually thought I might pee my pants in the moment. Still, desperation spurred me onward. I hoped to God he wouldn't keep pace up the hill. His howls grew louder, a chilling soundtrack to my desperate flight. His rage was palpable, each scream a reminder of the danger that pursued me. My legs burned, my mind a whirlwind of terror. I pushed harder, my feet barely touching the ground as I reached the top of the hill. I looked over my shoulder and saw my prayers had been answered. He couldn't keep his pace up such a steep incline. I wasted no time and continued to bolt towards the fence. That was the last realistic place where he could catch me. I could see the chain link just beyond the tree branches. With a final burst of energy, I hurled myself over it, my hands scraping against the rough metal. I landed on the other side, heart racing as I looked back. The man was nowhere to be seen. The silence that quickly followed was like nothing I had ever experienced before, true relief. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I jogged through the cemetery, my eyes scanning for any sign of that man, my thoughts a chaotic mess of fear and disbelief. I also kept an eye peeled for a groundskeeper, really anybody I could get the attention of and let them know that I was in danger. But no one came around. Once I reached the other side of the cemetery, I just sprinted for home. When I arrived, breathless and wide-eyed, I told my parents what had just happened. Their faces were pale, but their responses were practical. They called the police, but the search yielded nothing. Shocking, right? The man was never found, and the police could offer me no explanation. They went out there, but the stuff I spoke about was gone. Even my sack of mushrooms. No empty baggies, no beer bottles, nothing. It was as if everything had been sucked up into the sky. Both my parents and the police gave me these long talks. Their warnings were stern but futile. Don't go out alone. Be careful. They said it with the weight of parental concern, but it did little to alleviate the gnawing sense of dread that had settled deep in my gut. How close to death had I just come? To this day, that incident remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my childhood. The image of that bloody man in the creek, the remnants of that Ouija board, and the eerie silence of the forest haunt me. The cemetery became a symbol of my brush with something dark and sinister, something that should have never been uncovered. It's like the line between reality had gotten blurred out there, and I crossed over into a time when something else was going on, as I was the only one who saw it. I know it sounds crazy and unbelievable, but hey, it's my story, and it happened. In the years that followed, I never quite shook off the fear that incident instilled in me. My passion for mushroom hunting waned, the thrill of discovery overshadowed by the memory of that terrifying chase. I still love nature, but I no longer venture into the woods alone. The forest, once a place of wonder and discovery, now holds a hint of menace, a reminder that sometimes the most frightening things lurk in the places we least expect. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about that strange, terrible day. I wonder about the man in the creek, who he was, where he came from, and what dark purpose brought him to our quiet town. I think about the Ouija board and those strange figurines, pondering what rituals might have taken place in that secluded meadow. But mostly, I think about how close I came to becoming another mystery in those woods. How a simple hobby, an innocent passion, led me to the brink of something I still don't fully understand. It's a reminder that the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between safety and danger, is often thinner than we realize. And so, while I may no longer roam the forests in search of mushrooms, the lessons I learned that day stay with me. To be aware of my surroundings, to trust my instincts, and to remember that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that teach us about ourselves and the world we live in, even if those lessons come at a terrifying cost. In the sprawling corridors of my old middle school, there was one door that stood out from all the rest. It wasn't its appearance that made it unique. It was a standard, institutional-grade metal door, painted the same dull beige as every other door in the building. What set it apart was the fact that it was always locked. Not once, in all my years at that school, did I ever see it open. The door was a source of endless fascination and speculation among the students. Rumors about what lay behind it spread like wildfire through the hallways. Some said it led to an abandoned military bunker, a relic from the Cold War era when every public building was required to have a fallout shelter. Others whispered about a torture chamber where misbehaving students were sent to face unspeakable punishments. And then there were the more mundane theories, my least favorite being that it was just another janitor's closet, filled with mops and cleaning supplies. But regardless of what we believed was behind it, one thing was certain: whenever I walked past that door, I was overcome by an eerie feeling that I couldn't explain. It was as if the air around it was charged with some kind of invisible energy, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sensation would come as quickly as it disappeared, leaving me wondering if I had imagined it. As the end of my last year in middle school approached, I had all but forgotten about the mysterious door. The excitement of graduation and the promise of high school had pushed it to the back of my mind. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was preparing to head home after the final bell. The hallways were a chaos of slamming lockers and chattering students, everyone eager to escape the confines of the school. I was making my way towards the exit when I passed by that familiar door. Something was different this time. The eerie feeling that had always accompanied my encounters with the door was absent. Curious, I turned my eyes towards it, examining it more closely than I ever had before. That's when I saw a slight opening, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. My heart began to race. After all these years, the door was finally ajar. I glanced around, making sure no one was watching, and then made a split-second decision. I knew my mom wouldn't mind if I wasn't home right after school. I often went to a friend's house to play video games. This was my chance to finally unravel the mystery that had plagued us for so long. I waited until the hallway was clear, then slipped through the opening. The door closed behind me with a soft click, plunging me into total darkness. I fumbled for my phone, cursing under my breath when I saw it was only at 10% battery. Beggars can't be choosers, I thought, as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light revealed a sight that took my breath away. Instead of a classroom or a storage closet, I found myself at the top of a steep staircase. The steps were carved from medieval stone bricks, as were the walls surrounding them. It looked like something out of a fantasy movie, completely at odds with the modern school building I had just left. Curiosity overwhelmed any sense of caution I might have had. I began to descend the stairs, the light from my phone casting eerie shadows on the ancient stonework. With each step, that familiar feeling of unease returned, growing stronger the further down I went. I was about halfway down when I heard a loud bang echo through the stairwell. It sounded like it came from above me, perhaps the door closing. I paused for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, but then continued my descent. In hindsight, I wish I had paid more attention to that sound. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the bottom of the stairs. I checked my phone. 15 minutes had passed, and my battery was down to 5%. The staircase had led me to a long tunnel, lined with unlit torches. At the far end, I could make out a wooden door. In the corner of the tunnel, I spotted a light switch. With my phone now at 4%, I decided to conserve its battery. I turned off the flashlight and flipped the switch. To my amazement, the torches along the walls burst into life, bathing the tunnel in a warm, flickering light. As I walked through the tunnel, the feeling of unease that had been building since I entered the stairwell began to fade. By the time I reached the wooden door at the end, it had disappeared entirely. I placed my hand on the rough wood, taking a deep breath before slowly pushing it open. The room beyond was dark, much darker than the tunnel. I could barely make out a pedestal in the center and something on the floor. Before I could investigate further, I heard footsteps approaching. Panicking, I slipped inside and quietly closed the door behind me, then ran to hide behind what I thought was a large piece of furniture in the darkness. From my hiding spot, I could now see that the something on the floor was some kind of writing. It looked like it had been done in red paint, forming symbols and patterns that reminded me of the cult documentaries I'd watched late at night when I couldn't sleep. The door creaked open, and two robed figures entered the room. One was dragging a long black garbage bag, while the other carried what looked like an ancient book. The one with the bag dropped it unceremoniously on the floor and disappeared into the darkness of the room. The other placed the book on the pedestal and called out, "You got the table yet?" "Almost," came the reply from the darkness. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A pale hand was poking out of the garbage bag. My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. Was it a prop for some kind of sick game? Or was it real? Fear gripped me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I covered my mouth to muffle my panic breathing and waited for an opportunity to escape. When the figure by the pedestal seemed distracted, I began to inch towards the door. I was mere feet away from freedom when a hand clamped down on my shoulder. "So, there was someone in here after all," said a raspy voice behind me. "I guess so," replied the other figure, his tone unnervingly calm. "What are you going to do to me?" I cried, struggling against the iron grip that held me. The figure by the pedestal let out a chilling laugh. "It's not us you need to worry about," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "It's them." Suddenly, the room was flooded with light, revealing a scene straight out of my worst nightmares. Standing on either side of me were two pale, humanoid creatures, each at least 7 feet tall. They had no eyes, no ears, just an impossibly wide, malicious smile and a crooked nose. Their limbs were too long, too thin, bending at unnatural angles. The robed figure released me and joined his companion, leaving me face to face with these monstrosities. I tried to run, to scream, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with fear, rooted to the spot as the creatures began to approach me. As they drew closer, a horrifying realization dawned on me. The furniture I had been hiding behind wasn't furniture at all. It had been one of these creatures, standing perfectly still in the darkness. One of the beings stretched out a hand towards me, its fingers unnaturally long and tipped with razor-sharp claws. As it was about to touch me, something in my mind snapped. The paralysis broke, and I bolted for the door. I tore through the tunnel, my feet barely touching the ground. Behind me, I could hear the creatures in pursuit, their movements making a sickening, skittering sound against the stone floor. I reached the stairs and began to climb, taking them two at a time in my desperation to escape. Halfway up, an ear-piercing screech echoed through the stairwell. The sound was like nothing I had ever heard before, a mixture of nails on a chalkboard and the wail of a dying animal. It spurred me on, giving me a burst of energy I didn't know I possessed. I finally reached the top of the stairs, only to find the door closed. With mounting horror, I realized that the bang I had heard earlier must have been the door shutting behind me. I pounded on it with all my might, screaming for help, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, I could hear the creatures getting closer, their screeches growing louder. I was trapped, cornered like an animal. Just as I was about to give up hope, the door suddenly swung open. Without hesitation, I hurled myself through the opening, slamming it shut behind me. Panting and shaking, I looked around to thank whoever had saved me, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen at the school. Staff members and students started to disappear. The police were called in to investigate, and they eventually opened that mysterious door. But when they searched the room beyond, they found nothing, no tunnel, no stairs, no creatures. The only thing there was a letter on a pedestal, bearing 5 chilling words, "We will find you, kid." Later, it was revealed that the door could only be opened from the outside. This revelation only deepened the mystery of my escape. How had the door opened when there was no one there to open it for me? Years have passed since that day, but the memory of what I saw behind that door has never left me. Lately, I've begun to fear that the creatures have made good on their promise. For the past week, I've been sleeping with a 6-inch knife under my pillow. Every night, I see them, those pale, eyeless faces, hunched over my bed with their malicious grins. I don't know how much longer I have before they come for me. But I won't go without a fight. Whatever happens, I need people to know the truth about what lurks behind that locked door in my old middle school. If you're reading this, be careful. And whatever you do, don't let your curiosity get the better of you. Some doors are meant to stay locked. In the sweltering summer of 2006, I found myself behind the wheel of a flatbed truck, hauling a load of construction materials through the heart of rural Tennessee. The exact location escapes me now, lost in the fog of memory, but I reckon it was somewhere between Memphis and Nashville, inching closer to that nebulous intersection where Tennessee meets Mississippi and Alabama. It was the kind of place where the trees outnumbered the people, and the roads twisted through the landscape like veins in an aging hand. My cargo was a mishmash of house-building essentials, drywall sheets stacked like oversized playing cards, bundles of roofing shingles that smelled of tar and potential, and more pre-packaged flooring than I'd ever seen in one place. It was a Tetris game of epic proportions, and I'd used every tie-down strap in my arsenal to keep it from sliding off the back of my truck. The load was so precarious that I'd spent an extra hour at the shipper's yard, meticulously tarping everything down. Or so I thought. About 5 miles down the road, deep in the bowels of nowhere, on a 2-lane blacktop that seemed to stretch into eternity, I noticed my tarp flapping in the wind like a distress signal. "Shit," I muttered, scanning the roadside for a place to pull over. Fortune smiled on me, and I found a wide shoulder that could accommodate my rig without risking life and limb. As I climbed out of the cab, the humid air hit me like a wet blanket. The woods pressed in close on both sides of the road, their green canopy blocking out most of the sky. It was the kind of place where you half expected to see eyes glowing in the underbrush, watching your every move. I shook off the thought and got to work. It didn't take long to realize that my initial tarping job was subpar at best. Cursing my earlier haste, I decided to redo the whole thing right there on the side of the road. I undid all the bungee straps, their elastic snapping back with enough force to leave welts on my arms. I dragged the tarps off, rolled them back up, and started the process anew. As I was unrolling the first tarp across the load, movement caught my eye. A lone figure was walking down the road towards my truck. Even from a distance, I could tell this guy was down on his luck. He moved with a shuffling gait, empty-handed and clearly unkempt. As he drew closer, I could make out a far-off stare in his eyes, like he was looking through the world rather than at it. I took stock of my surroundings, remembering that I was a good 10 to 20 miles deep into public forest land. There weren't any houses or cabins out here, just miles of green solitude punctuated by the occasional logging road or hiking trail. Sure, there could be day hikers or campers around, but something about this guy's presence felt off. He was alone on a road where even cars were a rarity. I tried to push my unease aside and focus on the task at hand. The tarps needed securing, and I couldn't let one strange wanderer distract me from my job. Still, I kept one eye on him as I worked, watching his slow but steady approach. By the time I had the tarps back in place and was climbing down to start hooking the bungee straps, the man had drawn close enough that I could no longer ignore his presence. As a precaution, I grabbed my winch bar and set it on the trailer where I was working. It was an 8-pound solid metal bar, about 4 feet long, with one end tapered to a blunt point and the other sporting a hollow opening. Officially, it was for tightening straps and chains. Unofficially, it was a damn good deterrent for any trouble that might come knocking. As the man finally reached me, the first thing that struck me was his hair. It was a mullet gone wrong, patchy and uneven, like he'd tried to cut it himself while riding a mechanical bull. Business in the front, party in the back had never looked so apocalyptic. But it was his eyes that really got to me. They were clear, not glazed over like you'd expect from someone drunk or high. No, it was something else entirely. It was as if the lights were on, but nobody was home. The vacancy in his gaze sent a chill down my spine despite the summer heat. His clothes were a testament to hard times, threadbare, dirty, hanging off his gaunt frame like they belonged to someone else. His shoes were cheap white tennis sneakers, caked with mud and misery. One shoe was missing its laces entirely, the tongue lolling out like a dead man's. He stopped a few feet away from me and waited until I acknowledged him. When I did, he spoke in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed underfoot. I got a long walk. I nodded, trying to keep my voice neutral. Yeah, man, you do. We're in the middle of nowhere. I made it clear with my tone that there was no ride to be had here. He seemed to accept this, nodding slowly before shuffling past me. But he only made it as far as the driver's door of my truck before stopping, turning around, and coming back. He repeated himself, I've got a long walk. At this point, I felt a mix of pity and frustration. I explained as kindly as I could that I couldn't give him a ride. I mentioned insurance, company policy, anything I could think of to soften the rejection. I apologized for not being able to help more, hoping he'd take the hint and move on. He seemed to accept this second refusal, turning around and continuing down the road. I waited until he was a good distance away before returning to my work, but I kept one eye on his retreating figure as I finished securing the load. As I was putting the last of the bungee straps in place, I looked up to check on the stranger's progress. What I saw made my blood run cold. He had turned around and was heading back towards me at a rapid pace. Even more unsettling, it looked like he was talking on a cell phone. His hand was up to his face, and I could just make out his mouth moving, his other hand gesticulating wildly as if he was deep in conversation. I finished the straps in record time, grabbed my winch bar, and hopped down from the truck. I looked up just in time to see the man about 10 feet away, much closer than I expected. The sudden proximity startled me, and I blurted out, Jesus, man, you scared me to death. He just smiled and nodded, lowering his phone hand and giving me his full attention. There was something predatory in his gaze now, a hunger that hadn't been there before. I started to speak. Look, man, I can't. He cut me off. I know. Shut up. He chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. The hell did you just say to me? I growled, my grip tightening on the winch bar. He didn't respond, just took a few confident steps forward. I matched his advance, bringing the winch bar up before me like a medieval knight wielding a sword. He didn't even glance at it, taking one more step forward. Then, without warning, he blew a handful of sand directly into my eyes. The pain was immediate and intense. I was instantly blinded, nearly dropping to my knees from the shock. Through the burning agony, I could hear his shoes scuffling in the dirt around me, circling like a shark that had scented blood in the water. Panic surged through me, and I swung the winch bar wildly, hoping to connect with something, anything. But my desperate swings met only air. His footsteps receded slightly, and then a horrible realization dawned on me. He was going for my truck. I fumbled for the key fob in my pocket, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy. Finally, I managed to hit the lock button, hearing the satisfying click of the locks engaging. "Damn it!" I heard him curse. "I was hoping you left those in the ignition." There was a pause, and then his voice took on a more menacing tone. "Well, I guess now I have to take them from you." I frantically tried to clear my eyes, but it was useless. The sand was caked in there good, and I knew I'd need water or eye drops to restore my vision fully. I could see a little out of my right eye, a blurry, tear-streaked view of the world, and I did my best to keep track of my attacker as he stalked around me. He made several lunges for my pocket, his hands roughly patting me down, searching for the keys. I managed to push him off twice, but I could feel his fingers probing, getting closer to their prize with each attempt. On his third try, I swung the winch bar with all my might, feeling it connect solidly with his shoulder. He grunted in pain and stumbled back a few steps. Taking advantage of the momentary reprieve, I backed up towards my trailer, hoping to use it as cover. But in that instant, my vision blurred again, and I lost sight of him. The world went silent. I couldn't hear his breathing, his footsteps, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I rubbed at my eyes furiously, trying to clear them enough to spot any movement. Suddenly, I felt the trailer shift beneath my hands. With a jolt of terror, I realized he had climbed up onto it. He was going to come at me from above. Just as I started to step forward, I felt his arms snake around my throat from behind. If I hadn't felt the trailer move, he would have had me dead to rights. As it was, I managed to duck and shrug him off, using his own momentum to throw him off balance. In that moment of confusion, I made a break for it. I bolted for the truck, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I yanked the door open, hurled myself inside, and slammed it shut behind me, immediately hitting the lock button again for good measure. Safe inside the cab, I set the winch bar on the passenger seat and tried to get my bearings. My eyes were still burning, vision blurry, but I scanned the area for any sign of my attacker. What I saw next was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. The man was standing about 10 feet from the truck, talking into his hand again. But this time, he wasn't just talking, he was screaming, his face contorted with rage, spittle flying from his lips as he ranted at his imaginary phone. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I cranked the engine, threw it into gear, and pulled out onto the road without even checking for traffic. As I passed him, our eyes met for a brief moment. The look on his face was one of pure, unhinged malevolence, his eyes boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I kept my foot heavy on the accelerator until I hit 5th, then 6th gear. When I finally dared to check my rearview mirror, he was gone, as if he'd never existed at all. A mile or so down the road, I found a safe place to pull over and properly clean out my eyes. By the time I was done, my vision had mostly cleared, but there was still no sign of the strange, violent man who had attacked me. To this day, that encounter remains the most terrifying experience of my life. I reported it to the police and my employers, of course, but nothing ever came of it. Sometimes, on long hauls through isolated stretches of country, I find myself scanning the roadsides, half expecting to see that crazed figure shambling towards me. I often wonder about that man, about what drove him to such desperation and madness. Was he truly insane, or just a predator who had found the perfect hunting ground in those lonely forests? And what would have happened if I hadn't been able to get away? But mostly, I think about how quickly an ordinary day can turn into a nightmare, how thin the line is between safety and mortal danger. That experience changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. It taught me that sometimes the most dangerous things aren't the wild animals or the treacherous roads, but the people we encounter in the most unexpected places. I still drive that same route sometimes, and every time I pass that stretch of road, I feel a chill run down my spine. I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, walking that long road to nowhere, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to stop and offer help. In my darkest moments, I find myself hoping that guy got run over on his long walk to nowhere. It's not a kind thought, I know, but neither was he. And in this line of work, in those remote places where civilization feels like a distant memory, sometimes unkind thoughts are all that stand between you and the darkness that lurks just beyond the reach of your headlights. They say that children are more attuned to the supernatural realm, their minds more open to the whispers from beyond the veil that separates our world from the unknown. I'm not sure if I truly believe that, but I can't deny the experiences that shaped my childhood, experiences that have left an indelible mark on my psyche, even as an adult. As a child, I was plagued by recurring nightmares, each more vivid and terrifying than the last. These were your typical childhood fears of monsters under the bed or shadows in the closet. No, these dreams were something else entirely, something that felt far too real to be dismissed as mere flights of fancy. In these bizarre nocturnal visions, I would often find myself in familiar settings, my home, my neighborhood, but twisted into nightmarish versions of themselves. The most unsettling element, however, was always the same, a demonic presence that would speak to me through various manifestations. Sometimes it was through flames that danced in our attic, casting writhing shadows on the walls. Other times, it emerged from the depths of an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The voice was always the same, evil, malicious, dripping with a hatred that seemed to transcend human understanding. It would threaten me, my family, or sometimes speak in languages I couldn't comprehend, the guttural sounds filling me with an inexplicable dread. But there's one nightmare in particular that has stayed with me throughout my entire life, its details etched into my memory with painful clarity. Even now, years later, I can recall every moment as if it happened yesterday. The dream began on a night much like any other in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I found myself outside my house, which was unusual in itself. You see, in our household, we live by a strict rule: when the streetlights come on, it's time to come in, or you will be grounded. This rule was as immutable as the laws of physics, so my presence outside after dark immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. The night air was cool against my skin, carrying with it the faint scent of cut grass and the distant hum of crickets. But there was something else, too, an underlying wrongness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The shadows seemed deeper, the darkness between the streetlights more absolute than it should have been. I turned to look at my house, drawn by the warm glow emanating from the windows. Through the glass, I could see into our dining room, where my family was gathered around the table for dinner. The scene was so normal, so ordinary, that it made the wrongness of my situation even more apparent. My parents sat at either end of the table, my siblings in their usual places. I could see their mouths moving as they talked and laughed, passing dishes back and forth. But there was no sound. It was like watching a silent movie, a perfect facsimile of family life, but devoid of all audio. What struck me most, however, was their complete lack of concern for my absence. There was no empty chair at the table, no worried glances at the door. It was as if I didn't exist at all. Panic began to well up inside me. I ran to the window, pressing my hands against the cool glass. I banged on it, shouting at the top of my lungs, trying desperately to get their attention. But it was no use. They couldn't hear me. They couldn't see me. I was a ghost in my own home. Desperation mounting, I turned away from the window, my eyes scanning the familiar landscape of our street. That's when I noticed something that hadn't been there before: a swing set in our driveway. It was an old-fashioned metal frame with two swings, the kind you might see in a park from decades past. And on one of the swings sat my best friend, Kyle. Relief washed over me at the sight of him. Kyle lived just a house or two away from mine, and his presence was a comforting reminder of normalcy in this increasingly bizarre situation. But as I approached him, that sense of wrongness returned, stronger than ever. Kyle was swinging gently back and forth, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't seem to notice my approach, didn't respond when I called his name. When I reached the swing set and sat down beside him, he continued his rhythmic motion as if I wasn't there at all. "Kyle?" I said, my voice sounding small and frightened even to my own ears. "Kyle, can you hear me?" No response. Just the creaking of the swing chains and the soft scuff of his shoes on the ground. I reached out to touch his arm, but my hand passed right through him as if he were made of smoke. A chill ran down my spine, and I jerked my hand back, staring at it in disbelief. That's when I remembered the candy I had stashed in my backyard. In the twisted logic of dreams, I became convinced that if I could just get Kyle to eat some of the candy, he would snap out of whatever trance he was in. He would see me, talk to me, and everything would be okay. "Kyle, wait here, okay?" I said, even though he hadn't acknowledged me once. "I have a surprise for us. Just don't go anywhere. Please." I ran to the spot where I really did have Starburst hidden from my parents, behind a loose brick in the garden wall. My hands shook as I retrieved the slightly squashed packet, the familiar wrappers a splash of color in the monotone nightmare world. Clutching the candy like a lifeline, I sprinted back to the front of the house, hope blooming in my chest. But as I rounded the corner, that hope withered and died. The swing set was empty, one seat still swaying gently back and forth as if its occupant had just left. Kyle was gone. I stood there, frozen, the candy falling from my nerveless fingers. The wrongness that had been lurking at the edges of my perception now crashed over me like a wave. The houses up and down the street, which had been lit and alive just moments ago, were now dark and shuttered. It was as if everyone in the world had disappeared, leaving me alone in this silent, empty facsimile of my neighborhood. That's when I noticed the streetlights. One by one, starting from the far end of the street, they began to go out. It wasn't a gentle fading, but a sudden, violent extinguishing, as if something was devouring the light itself. And in the wake of each darkened lamppost, I could see it, that familiar darkness that I knew all too well from my other nightmares. It was deeper than the absence of light, or writhing, malevolent blackness that seemed to pulse with evil intent. And it was coming for me. Panic exploded in my chest. I ran back to my house, my safe haven, the one place where I should have been protected. I pounded on the door, rang the doorbell over and over, screaming for my parents, my siblings, anyone to let me in. But the house remained silent and dark. Through the window, I could see that the dining room was now empty, the chairs pushed neatly under the table as if the family dinner I had witnessed earlier had never happened at all. I turned back to the street, watching in horror as the darkness crept closer, extinguishing light after light. I could feel its hunger, its eagerness to finally claim me after all these years of tormenting my dreams. As the last streetlight flickered and died, plunging me into total darkness, I heard it, that familiar, demonic laughter that had haunted so many of my nightmares. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air around me, vibrating through my very bones. I squeezed my eyes shut, knowing that this was it. This would be the time it finally consumed me. I felt tricked, betrayed by my own mind, and utterly terrified. There was nothing I could do as the darkness closed in, its icy tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me into its embrace. The last thing I remember is the sound of that laughter growing louder, drowning out my screams as the darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the echo of that laughter still ringing in my ears. It took me several long moments to realize I was safe in my bed, that it had all been a dream. But had it? That was the last time I ever had a nightmare of that intensity. It was as if something had changed that night, as if the darkness had finally found what it was looking for and no longer needed to torment my sleeping mind. But sometimes, I wonder if it really did find its way in that day. Ever since then, I've been drawn to dark things in a way I can't explain. Occasionally, I'm blindsided by bouts of debilitating depression that seem to come out of nowhere, plunging me into a darkness that feels all too familiar. I know this was a dream, a product of my sleeping mind. But that doesn't make it any less real or true. The fear I felt, the hopelessness, the sense of being utterly alone in a world gone wrong, these were all real. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, when the shadows seem to move of their own accord and the silence feels heavy with unseen presence, I find myself wondering, did I ever really wake up? The vast, unforgiving expanse of Central Australia stretched out before me as I guided my modified truck-turned bus through the desert night. The vehicle, a behemoth forged from the broken body of a Mercedes fleet truck, rumbled steadily along the dirt road, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beams of hope in a sea of emptiness. I was more than 500 kilometers from the nearest town, truly in the middle of nowhere. But then again, most of Australia is the middle of nowhere. The majority of this enormous continent is uninhabitable, discouraged from even casual travel. With 80% of our population hugging the coastline, venturing into the outback means encountering more mirages than people, more danger than comfort. This particular journey was part of a 5-day charter, a mission of mercy and necessity. My cargo? A group of Aboriginal elder women en route to receive vital health checks, pap smears, mammograms, and other essential screenings that were simply unavailable in their remote communities. It's a sad reality that in these isolated areas, even basic medical care can be a luxury. There are doctors, sure, but they're equipped for only the most rudimentary treatments. Women's health? That's a whole different ballgame out here. Earlier that day, we had stopped in a place called Menavi, one of the few population centers close enough to serve these women's irregular needs. It's a small opal mining town in South Australia, a bit ramshackle but a veritable metropolis compared to the villages these women called home. Here, they could shop for clothing, enjoy a decent meal, maybe even indulge in a luxury like coffee, simple pleasures that were rare treats in their daily lives. We left Menavi late, embarking on the 3-hour journey back to our overnight accommodations. The next day, I'd be taking them back to their respective desert communities. This wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline. Without someone willing to drive these folks overnight, they'd be cut off from essential medicine and modern conveniences that most of us take for granted. As we rolled through the night, my passengers quickly succumbed to exhaustion. Even the nurse traveling with us had drifted off, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the endless road ahead. Our lodgings for the night were essentially a hostel for desert travelers, cheap, sparse rooms, but a true safe haven in the outback. It even had facilities to gas up the van and check the tires, luxuries not to be underestimated in this unforgiving landscape. So there I was, alone in the cab of this makeshift bus, feeling like a mother duck leading her little ducklings along. My 30 passengers slumbered peacefully in the darkness of the riding pod behind me. The clock on the dashboard read around 9 p.m., and I found myself fighting to stay alert. I cranked up my favorite music, letting it dribble through the speakers around me, anything to keep the van upright and on course. The monotony of the drive was suddenly broken when I spotted a headlight in the distance, coming towards me along the lonely desert road. I dimmed my lights instinctively, a habit born from years of night driving. Sometimes, especially at a distance, high beams can actually obscure what you're trying to see, creating a blinding glare instead of illumination. As I drove down into a slight dip of a dry creek bed, I found myself expecting to see a car with only one headlight any moment. It's not unusual to encounter vehicles with burned-out lights out here, where maintenance can be a luxury. I don't know why I was so certain it had only one light, but that thought was firmly planted in my mind. Emerging from the dip, I flicked my spotlights and high beams back on, ready to greet the oncoming vehicle. But there was nothing. No car, no bike, not even a stray kangaroo. Just empty dirt roads stretching to the horizon. I scanned the area carefully. There was no dust in the air, no sign of a vehicle having passed or turned off. I could see a good distance in every direction, and I was very clearly alone. That's when the first chill ran down my spine. My skin went slick with cold sweat as I realized that whatever I had seen no longer existed. It dawned on me why I had thought it was a car with one light. The apparition had been almost impossible to quantify. My brain, desperate to make sense of the inexplicable, had latched onto the most logical explanation. But logic had no place here, not in this vast, ancient desert under the indifferent stars. I kept the bright lights on, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as I pressed on. For the next hour, the road remained empty, devoid of any other signs of life or light. I debated waking someone, the nurse, perhaps, but what would I say? I saw a light that wasn't there. It sounded crazy even in my own head. So I let them sleep, carrying the weight of my unease alone. Just as I was starting to convince myself that fatigue had played tricks on my eyes, we went through another dip in the highway. As we emerged, my blood turned to ice in my veins. There, barely 100 yards away, was a raging globe of light barreling right at the side of the bus. It was coming straight for my door, moving so fast that I instinctively braced for impact, certain we were about to be sent sliding across the road in a tangle of metal and screams. But the collision never came. The glow came within inches of the bus, so close I swear I could feel its heat through the glass, and then simply winked out. One moment it was there, filling my vision with its otherworldly radiance, and the next it had disappeared into nothing, just like before. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing and the steady rumble of the engine. I gripped the wheel with every ounce of strength I possessed, forcing myself to press on through the dark. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen, but every explanation fell short. This was something beyond my understanding, beyond the realm of the normal world I thought I knew. When we finally arrived at the hostel, I was a bundle of frayed nerves barely held together. Before letting the passengers disembark, I swallowed my pride and asked if any of them had seen any lights. Their confused responses, "What light?" only confirmed my growing unease. Briefly, haltingly, I explained what I had witnessed. The reaction was immediate and unsettling. The women fell silent, exchanging loaded glances that spoke volumes in their wordlessness. After a moment, they began speaking hurriedly to each other in their own language, their tones urgent and tinged with fear. Then, without further explanation, they all got off the bus, their movements quick and nervous, as if eager to put distance between themselves and the vehicle or perhaps what had been following it. I didn't press for answers, instead focusing on my routine inspection of the bus. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that I had brushed against something ancient and unknowable out there in the desert night. A few minutes later, a couple of the older women approached me. Their faces were etched with concern as they asked me to recount exactly what I had seen, urging me not to leave out a single detail. I obliged, describing the events down to the minute, including where I had seen the lights, how I felt, and my best guess at the distances involved. With each detail I shared, the women seemed to grow more distressed, exchanging glances heavy with unspoken understanding. Now, I'm not easily rattled. I'm a big guy, and I've lived on 3 continents. My career path has been varied: police officer, teacher, bus driver, coach, trucker, and I've seen my fair share of the world's wonders and horrors. I consider myself a skeptic, but with an open mind. Not much in this world scares me. But the reaction of these women, who had lived in this harsh landscape for generations, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the desert night. After I finished my account, 2 of the older ladies looked at me with eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something akin to awe. I had developed a good rapport with the indigenous people of Central Australia during my time there, and I knew when something truly shook them. Their words, spoken in hushed, reverent tones, will stay with me forever. "Driver, we are so lucky that you did not stop, because if you did, no one would have seen any of us ever again. We'd all be gone." When I pressed for an explanation, they just shook their heads, refusing to elaborate. All they would say was that it was a very old entity, one that had lived on the Australian continent for eons, perhaps since the dawn of time itself. The fear in their eyes told me more than their words ever could. I took their warning at face value, recognizing the weight of millennia of oral tradition and survival knowledge behind their words. I didn't mention it again to any of the riders, not wanting to further upset them or trivialize their beliefs. It wasn't until I returned to the city where I lived that I brought it up again, asking some friends and coworkers about the experience. Their reactions were markedly different from the Aboriginal women's. They laughed it off, casually explaining that I had encountered the Min Min lights, a well-known phenomenon in Western Queensland. But something about their easy dismissal didn't sit right with me. What I had seen, what those women had reacted to with such visceral fear, felt like more than just a quirk of the landscape or a trick of the light. The conviction in the women's voices, the way they spoke of it as something you did not want to meet in the desert late at night, struck a chord deep within me. I've since learned that this phenomenon is indeed one of the oldest myths in Australian history, deeply woven into the fabric of the land and its people. I may have only seen it once, and only for a few minutes, but the impact of that encounter has stayed with me. It might have looked like a simple car headlight a couple of kilometers up the road to my uninitiated eyes, but the reaction of those women whose people have survived in this desolate, remote part of the continent for 60,000 years tells a different story. Their fear, their respect for this unknown entity, speaks volumes. I don't know what it was that I saw out there in the vast emptiness of the outback. I don't know if it was a natural phenomenon, a shared hallucination born of fatigue and isolation, or something more sinister and otherworldly. But I do know this: if the people who have called this harsh land home for tens of thousands of years are scared of it, I'm inclined to take their word for it. Whatever it was, I have no desire to encounter it again, no wish to test the limits of its patience or intentions. The Australian outback is a place of profound beauty and danger, where the line between the known and the unknown, the natural and the supernatural, can blur in the blink of an eye. It's a land that demands respect and caution in equal measure. And sometimes, the wisest course of action is to keep driving, to resist the urge to investigate, and to be grateful for the narrow escapes we might not even realize we've had.